The morning mist hung thick over the Vietnamese jungle like a gray blanket. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez checked his medical bag one more time as the helicopters approached the landing zone. He had been a combat medic for 2 years, but something felt different about this mission. The intelligence reports mentioned heavy enemy activity in the area, and the brass seemed more nervous than usual. Rodriguez was part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and today they were heading deep into enemy territory to search for a suspected weapons cache. The plan seemed simple enough. Get in, find the weapons, destroy them, and get out. But in Vietnam, nothing was ever that simple. As the chopper touched down, Rodriguez jumped out with the rest of his squad. The jungle was eerily quiet except for the distant sound of the rotors fading away. Captain Williams gathered the men around him for a final briefing. They would split into 3 groups and sweep through the area in a coordinated search pattern. Rodriguez was assigned to Alpha Company, which would take the eastern route through the densest part of the jungle. As they moved through the thick vegetation, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to press in on them from all sides, and every shadow could hide an enemy soldier. The first few hours passed without incident. The men moved carefully through the undergrowth, checking for booby traps and keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of the enemy. Rodriguez stayed close to the point man, knowing that if trouble started, he would be needed quickly. Around midday, they found what they were looking for. Hidden beneath camouflage tarps was a massive stockpile of weapons and ammunition. There were enough rifles, rockets, and explosives to supply an entire regiment. Captain Williams radioed the discovery back to headquarters and called for the demolition team to move up. But as the demolition experts began setting their charges, the jungle suddenly came alive with gunfire. Muzzle flashes erupted from the trees on 3 sides, and the distinctive crack of AK-47s filled the air. The Americans had walked straight into a carefully planned ambush. Rodriguez hit the ground as bullets whizzed overhead, cutting through leaves and bark. He could hear men shouting orders and calling for their medic. The firing was intense and coming from multiple directions. It was clear that the enemy had been waiting for them, and now they were surrounded. Captain Williams tried to organize a defense, but the enemy fire was too heavy. Every time someone tried to move, a sniper would pin them down. Rodriguez crawled from position to position, treating wounded soldiers while bullets flew just inches above his head. He had never experienced anything like this before. As the afternoon wore on, the situation became desperate. Radio contact with the other companies was sporadic, and it became clear that all 3 groups were under heavy attack. The enemy had planned this perfectly, and now 280 American soldiers were trapped in the jungle with nowhere to run. Rodriguez looked around at his fellow soldiers, many of them barely out of high school, and knew that their survival depended on staying calm and working together. The real test was just beginning, and he would need every bit of his training to keep his men alive in what was quickly becoming a fight for their lives. The enemy fire intensified as darkness began to fall over the jungle. Rodriguez had been crawling between wounded soldiers for hours, his medical supplies running dangerously low. The khaki uniform he had put on that morning was now torn and stained with blood from the men he had been treating. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, lay behind a fallen log with a bullet wound in his shoulder. His face was pale, and Rodriguez could see the fear in his eyes. "Am I going to die, Doc?" Johnson whispered, using the nickname all the soldiers gave to their medic. Rodriguez worked quickly to stop the bleeding while bullets continued to snap through the air above them. "Not on my watch, kid," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He had already treated 12 wounded soldiers, and the night was just beginning. Captain Williams crawled over to Rodriguez's position, his radio crackling with static. "The other companies are in the same situation," he said grimly. "Bravo Company has 15 wounded, and Charlie Company is completely cut off. We're not getting any air support until morning because of the weather." The rain had started to fall, turning the jungle floor into thick mud. Rodriguez realized that they would have to survive the entire night surrounded by enemy forces. He looked at his medical bag and knew he didn't have enough supplies to treat all the wounded men until help arrived. As if reading his thoughts, Captain Williams pointed to a small clearing about 50 meters away. "Intelligence says there might be a supply drop point over there from a previous mission. If there are medical supplies, we need them." Rodriguez studied the open ground between their position and the clearing. Enemy snipers had clear lines of sight across the area, and anyone who tried to cross would be an easy target. But without those supplies, the wounded men might not survive until dawn. "I'll go," Rodriguez said without hesitation. Captain Williams grabbed his arm. "That's suicide, Doc. We'll find another way." But Rodriguez had already made up his mind. He had taken an oath to help the wounded, and he wasn't going to watch good men die when there might be supplies just 50 meters away. He checked his pistol and prepared to make the most dangerous sprint of his life. Sergeant Martinez, a veteran with 3 tours under his belt, volunteered to provide covering fire. "When I start shooting, you run like hell and don't look back," he told Rodriguez. The medic took a deep breath and waited for the signal. When Martinez opened fire, drawing the attention of the enemy snipers, Rodriguez burst from cover and ran across the open ground. Bullets kicked up dirt all around his feet, and he could hear the angry buzz of rounds passing just inches from his head. He dove into the clearing and immediately began searching through the thick vegetation. His heart pounded as he pushed aside branches and leaves, desperately looking for any sign of supplies. Behind him, he could hear the firefight continuing as his fellow soldiers tried to keep the enemy occupied. Then his hand touched something hard buried under a pile of rotting leaves. It was a waterproof container, and when he opened it, Rodriguez almost cried with relief. Inside were bandages, morphine, antibiotics, and other medical supplies that could keep his wounded men alive through the night. But getting back to his position would be even more dangerous. The enemy now knew exactly where he was, and they would be ready for him. Rodriguez gathered the supplies and prepared for the sprint of his lifetime, knowing that the lives of his fellow soldiers depended on his making it back alive. Rodriguez clutched the medical supplies to his chest and waited for the right moment. The enemy fire had concentrated on his position, and he could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different locations. Getting back to his men would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. Sergeant Martinez must have sensed what Rodriguez was planning, because suddenly the entire American line erupted in gunfire. Every soldier who could still shoot opened up on the enemy positions, creating enough chaos for Rodriguez to make his move. He sprinted back across the clearing, zigzagging as bullets whined past his ears. A round tore through his sleeve, another kicked dirt into his face, but somehow he made it back to cover without being hit. The soldiers cheered quietly as he dove behind their defensive line with the precious medical supplies. Rodriguez immediately went to work on the most seriously wounded. Private Thompson had taken shrapnel in his leg and was losing blood fast. Using the fresh supplies, Rodriguez was able to properly clean and bandage the wound, giving Thompson a shot of morphine to ease the pain. Corporal Davis had been hit in the chest and was having trouble breathing. Rodriguez worked carefully to seal the wound and help Davis breathe more easily. One by one, he moved through the wounded soldiers, using his new supplies to give them a real chance of surviving until morning. But the enemy wasn't finished with them yet. Around midnight, Rodriguez heard movement in the jungle. The enemy was trying to get closer under cover of darkness. Captain Williams passed the word quietly. They were planning a night attack. Rodriguez found himself in an impossible situation. He needed to stay with the wounded soldiers who couldn't move, but he also had to be ready to defend himself if the enemy broke through their lines. He checked his pistol and made sure he had enough ammunition. The attack came just before dawn. Enemy soldiers charged through the jungle, their battle cries echoing through the trees. The Americans fought desperately, knowing that if their line broke, the wounded men would be defenseless. Rodriguez found himself fighting side by side with his patients. Private Johnson, despite his wounded shoulder, grabbed a rifle and helped defend their position. Corporal Davis, still weak from his chest wound, managed to throw grenades at attacking enemy soldiers. The fighting was brutal and up close. Rodriguez had to stop treating wounds several times to fight off enemy soldiers who got too close to the wounded. He shot 2 enemy fighters who were advancing on Private Thompson's position, then immediately went back to changing bandages. As the sun began to rise, the enemy attack finally stopped. They had been beaten back, but at a terrible cost. Rodriguez looked around and realized he now had 23 wounded soldiers to care for, and his supplies were running low again. That's when they heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant rumble of helicopters approaching. Air support was finally on the way, and with it the hope of medical evacuation for the wounded. But Rodriguez knew their ordeal wasn't over yet. The enemy was still out there, and getting the wounded soldiers to the evacuation point would require one more dangerous journey through the jungle. He gathered his remaining medical supplies and prepared for what he hoped would be the final phase of their nightmare. Captain Williams looked at Rodriguez with admiration. In less than 24 hours, the young medic had risked his life repeatedly to save his fellow soldiers. "You've done something incredible here, Doc," the captain said. "These men are alive because of you." Rodriguez just nodded and continued working on his patients. He wouldn't rest until every wounded soldier was safely on those helicopters. The helicopters circled overhead, but they couldn't land where the soldiers were pinned down. The jungle was too thick, and enemy fire made it impossible for the aircraft to get close enough for evacuation. Captain Williams received word over the radio that they would have to move the wounded to a clearing half a mile away. Rodriguez looked at his patients and felt his heart sink. Many of them were too badly injured to walk that distance, and carrying them through the jungle while under enemy fire would be nearly impossible. But they had no choice. It was either attempt the dangerous journey or watch the wounded men die from their injuries. Private Thompson's leg wound had reopened during the night attack, and he was barely conscious from blood loss. Corporal Davis was having trouble breathing again, and his lips were turning blue. These men needed immediate medical attention that only a hospital could provide. The plan was simple but dangerous. The able-bodied soldiers would carry the wounded while other men provided security. Rodriguez would move between the groups, treating anyone who couldn't make the journey. They would have to move fast because the enemy knew about the evacuation and would try to stop them. As they prepared to move out, Rodriguez made a difficult decision. He gave away most of his remaining medical supplies to other soldiers, keeping only the most essential items. If someone was badly injured during the movement, he needed to be able to treat them quickly without being weighed down by extra equipment. The journey began at first light. Rodriguez helped load Private Thompson onto a makeshift stretcher, while 2 soldiers prepared to carry him. The young soldier was unconscious now, and Rodriguez wasn't sure he would survive the trip to the landing zone. Enemy snipers opened fire as soon as the Americans began moving through the jungle. Rodriguez found himself running from position to position, treating soldiers who were hit during the evacuation. Sergeant Martinez took a bullet in the arm but refused to be carried, insisting he could still fight. The worst moment came when they were halfway to the landing zone. Corporal Davis collapsed, unable to breathe properly. Rodriguez had to stop the entire column while he worked frantically to save the soldier's life. With enemy bullets cutting through the trees around them, Rodriguez performed an emergency procedure to help Davis breathe. For 10 terrifying minutes, Rodriguez worked on Davis while the other soldiers formed a defensive circle around them. Enemy forces were closing in from 3 directions, and ammunition was running low. Several soldiers were down to their last few rounds. Finally, Rodriguez managed to stabilize Davis enough to continue the journey, but they had lost precious time, and the enemy was getting closer. Captain Williams made the difficult decision to leave some equipment behind so they could move faster. As they approached the landing zone, Rodriguez could see the helicopters waiting for them. Medical personnel were already setting up a field hospital to treat the wounded as soon as they arrived. But between them and safety lay 200 meters of open ground that enemy snipers had covered. The evacuation had to be done in stages. The most seriously wounded would go first, followed by those who could still walk. Rodriguez would stay with each group, making sure no one was left behind. Private Thompson was loaded onto the first helicopter, still unconscious but alive. Rodriguez had managed to keep him stable during the entire journey through the jungle. As the helicopter lifted off, Rodriguez felt a moment of relief. At least one of his patients was safe. But there were still 22 wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation, and enemy forces were getting closer to the landing zone. Rodriguez could hear gunfire in the distance as the rear guard tried to hold off the advancing enemy. Time was running out, and he knew that not everyone might make it out alive. Corporal Davis was loaded onto the second helicopter, breathing better, but still in critical condition. Rodriguez squeezed his hand as the medical team took over his care. "You're going to be fine," he told Davis, hoping it was true. As the second helicopter departed, Rodriguez looked back toward the jungle and saw enemy soldiers advancing through the trees. The final phase of the evacuation was about to become a desperate race against time. Enemy mortars began falling around the landing zone as the third helicopter arrived. Rodriguez threw himself over Private Williams, a young soldier with a severe head injury, protecting him from the flying shrapnel. The helicopter pilot was shouting over the noise of the rotors, urging them to hurry. Rodriguez and 2 other soldiers quickly loaded Williams and 5 other wounded men onto the helicopter. As it lifted off, an enemy mortar round exploded just 20 meters away, sending dirt and debris flying everywhere. The helicopter wobbled but managed to climb safely away from the landing zone. Now there were only 8 wounded soldiers left, plus Rodriguez and a dozen able-bodied men to defend them. Captain Williams was organizing the final defensive line, while Rodriguez worked on Sergeant Collins, who had been hit by shrapnel from the mortar blast. The enemy was now less than 100 meters away, and Rodriguez could see individual soldiers moving through the trees. The 4th helicopter was approaching, but it would be several minutes before it could land. Those might be the longest minutes of Rodriguez's life. Sergeant Collins grabbed Rodriguez's arm with surprising strength. "Doc, I'm not going to make it," he whispered. The shrapnel had caused internal bleeding that Rodriguez couldn't stop with his limited supplies. "Don't talk like that," Rodriguez replied, working frantically to treat the wound, but deep down he knew Collins was right. The injury was too severe, and they were too far from proper medical facilities. Collins seemed to understand. "Promise me something, Doc. Make sure the young kids get out first. I've had my time." Rodriguez wanted to argue, but another mortar round exploded nearby, reminding him that they were running out of time. The helicopter was finally approaching, and he had to make impossible decisions about who to evacuate first. As the 4th helicopter touched down, Rodriguez helped load 6 wounded soldiers aboard. Collins insisted on staying behind with the final group, even though Rodriguez knew the sergeant probably wouldn't survive much longer. The helicopter lifted off just as enemy soldiers broke through the defensive line. Rodriguez and the remaining men had to fall back to a smaller perimeter around the final wounded soldiers. They were now completely surrounded with nowhere to run. Rodriguez found himself fighting with his pistol while simultaneously trying to treat Collins and Private Baker, who had been shot in the stomach during the enemy breakthrough. It was chaos. Bullets flying everywhere, men shouting orders, and the wounded crying for help. The 5th helicopter pilot was a true hero. Despite heavy enemy fire, he brought his aircraft down in the middle of the firefight. Rodriguez could see bullet holes appearing in the helicopter's metal skin as enemy soldiers concentrated their fire on the aircraft. Working together, Rodriguez and the remaining soldiers loaded Collins and the other wounded men onto the helicopter. Collins looked up at Rodriguez one last time. "Thanks for everything, Doc. You're the bravest man I've ever known." As the helicopter lifted off with the last of the seriously wounded, Rodriguez realized he had accomplished something extraordinary. In 36 hours of continuous fighting, he had treated and evacuated 28 wounded soldiers. Not a single man under his care had died, despite the impossible conditions. But Rodriguez's own ordeal wasn't over yet. He and the remaining soldiers still had to fight their way out of the landing zone and reach a secondary evacuation point. Enemy forces were closing in from all sides, and ammunition was running critically low. Captain Williams gathered the survivors around him. There were only 15 men left, including Rodriguez, and they were facing at least 50 enemy soldiers. Their only hope was to break through the enemy line and reach friendly forces 5 miles away. Rodriguez checked his pistol one more time and prepared for what might be his final battle. He had saved 28 lives in the past day and a half, but now he had to focus on saving his own. The final breakout began at sunset. Rodriguez and the 14 remaining soldiers formed a tight formation and charged straight at the weakest point in the enemy line. They had no choice but to fight their way through or die trying. Rodriguez found himself in the middle of the most intense fighting of his life. He fired his pistol at enemy soldiers while helping wounded comrades who were hit during the breakout attempt. Sergeant Martinez went down with a bullet in his leg, and Rodriguez had to drag him to cover while bullets whizzed past their heads. The battle was fierce but brief. The surprise attack caught the enemy off guard, and the Americans managed to punch through their lines. But they weren't safe yet. Enemy forces were pursuing them through the jungle, and several soldiers were wounded during the fighting. Rodriguez treated Martinez's leg wound while they moved through the darkness. The sergeant was in pain but determined to keep going. "I'm not dying in this jungle, Doc," he said through gritted teeth. "My wife is expecting our first baby next month." They traveled through the night, following a compass heading toward friendly territory. Rodriguez stayed at the back of the group, helping anyone who fell behind. Private Johnson, whose shoulder wound had reopened, needed constant support to keep moving. Just before dawn, they heard the sound they had been hoping for. American voices calling through the jungle. A patrol from Bravo Company had been sent to look for survivors, and they had found them just in time. Rodriguez collapsed with exhaustion as friendly soldiers took over care of the wounded. He had been awake for more than 40 hours, treating injured men while fighting for his life. His uniform was torn and bloody. His medical supplies were gone and his hands were shaking from fatigue. Captain Williams found Rodriguez sitting against a tree, staring at his empty medical bag. "You know what you did back there, Doc?" the captain asked. "You saved every single wounded man in 3 companies. 28 soldiers are alive today because of you." Rodriguez just nodded, too tired to speak. He thought about Private Thompson, Corporal Davis, Sergeant Collins, and all the other soldiers he had treated during the nightmare in the jungle. Despite the impossible odds, he had managed to keep his promise. Not one man under his care had died. The rescue helicopters arrived an hour later to evacuate the survivors. As Rodriguez climbed aboard the aircraft, he looked back at the jungle where they had fought for their lives. Somewhere in those trees were the weapons cache they had been sent to destroy. But that mission seemed unimportant now compared to the lives they had saved. The pilot told Rodriguez that all 28 wounded soldiers had been successfully evacuated to hospitals. Thompson and Davis were expected to make full recoveries, and even Sergeant Collins was stable and receiving treatment for his internal injuries. As the helicopter flew toward the base hospital, Rodriguez finally allowed himself to rest. He had earned a reputation as the medic who would risk everything to save his fellow soldiers, and that reputation would follow him for the rest of his military career. 3 months later, Rodriguez was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during those desperate days in the jungle. But he always said the real heroes were the soldiers who fought beside him and the pilots who risked their lives to evacuate the wounded. Years after the war ended, Rodriguez would receive letters from the men he had saved. They wrote about their families, their careers, and their children, lives that might never have existed without the courage of one medic who refused to give up on his fellow soldiers. Rodriguez kept those letters in a box by his bedside, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not to destroy the enemy, but to save the people who matter most.